Hello all, and welcome to another edition of the African Epistemology's Advanced Seminar Series. Before we continue, please make sure that you rename yourself on Zoom, including your name and surname and preferably your institution to avoid being kicked out by the colleagues of HUMA. This is obviously a security measure to avoid Zoom bombing, so we hope that you can be able to rename yourself. My name is Olerato Mukumutsi. I am currently a PhD candidate in philosophy at the University of Cape Town and a doctoral fellow at HUMA, the Institute for Humanities in Africa. On behalf of the director of HUMA, Dr. Divine Fa, and the convener of the seminar series, Dr. Sanya Osha, we welcome you and thank you for joining us from whichever part of the world you reside in. At HUMA, we organize several seminar series, which may also be of interest to you, including the Publishing Africa Seminar Series, Attire Seminar Series, the Ethical Humanitarianism Series, the Doctoral Seminar Series, and the Book Launch Seminar Series on Monday. You can retrieve all this information on seminars through our website at www.huma.uct.ac.za. Right. In today's African Epistemology seminar, we have a very interesting speaker and philosopher who many of his interests align with my own. This is Dr. Reginald Odio. Dr. Reginald Odio holds a PhD in political philosophy from the University of Nairobi, Kenya. He is the first person with a complete visual impairment to be appointed to a substantive teaching position in a public university in Kenya. He is currently a senior lecturer in philosophy at the University of Nairobi. He is widely known for his activism for people living with disabilities, promoting the rights of persons with visual impairments and their scholarship in Africa. Over the past 31 years, he has lectured philosophy in 5 universities. He has special interests in African philosophy, political philosophy, ethics, and the rights of persons with disabilities, and the philosophy of religion. He has published several journal articles and book reviews. He was the founding editor-in-chief of the new series of thought and practice, a journal of the Philosophical Association of Kenya from 2009 to 2015. So in today's seminar, Dr. Odio will discuss the relevance of Mudimbe's The Invention of Africa to future directions in the humanities and social sciences, where he will seek to answer the following question: how can Mudimbe's critique of scholarship in Africa illuminate future directions in the humanities and the social sciences within the African context? Thank you, Dr. Odio, for joining us. Dr. Odio has been asked to speak for 30 to 35 minutes, and after he has completed his presentation, I will then open to the floor for questions and comments. Dr. Odio, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, you are audible. Thank you.
Can you see me?
Yes, that's right.
Great. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I am very grateful to Divine, the director of HUMA, for this amazing opportunity, and to Dr. Sanya Osha. Oh, we met with Sanya in amazing ways, and I'll tell that story another day, but I have found him to be an amazing person. We met in a situation where we had very different views, shall we say, opposed ones, and we were very, very cordial in the whole thing. And when we met in Dar es Salaam, it was wonderful to meet in person. And then last year, we met at the 4th Industrial Revolution workshop. And he asked me if I could consider giving this talk. And so I am very grateful to him as well. I will go straight to it, and I will try to do only 25 minutes because I think the most important part of a session such as this is the questions. After all, the speaker has had the privilege of speaking for so long, it shouldn't be too long. And so I want to apologize. I had a lovely set of PowerPoints. I enjoy PowerPoints. I even enjoy having plants in my house so that those who can see can enjoy them. I do not in any way seek to diminish the pleasure of sight because I don't have it. But as I tried to load it this morning, it just got stuck and threatened to actually hang my machine completely, which was a bit nightmarish. So I will talk without them, and I hope and believe that you will follow. Perhaps it will also welcome you to the world in which I live, where I can't view PowerPoints. Well, I start off with an introduction, and I say V.Y. Mudimbe's seminal work, The Invention of Africa, was an incisive and thought-provoking interrogation of the assumptions and presumptions of the humanities and social sciences insofar as they sought to study various aspects of cultures in Africa. He wrote, "The fact of the matter is that until now, Western interpreters, as well as African analysts, have been using categories and conceptual systems which depend on a Western epistemological order. Even in the most explicitly Afrocentric descriptions, models of analysis, explicitly or implicitly, knowingly or unknowingly, refer to the same order. Does this mean that African Weltanschauungen and African traditional systems of thought are unthinkable and cannot be made explicit within the framework of their own rationality? My own claim," says Mudimbe, "is that thus far the ways in which they have been evaluated and the means used to explain them relate to theories and methods whose constraints, rules, and systems of operation suppose an African epistemological locus." End of quote. Mudimbe draws our attention to the fact that much of what we normally and critically accept as scholarship on African culture has a Western imperialist agenda. For him, and I quote, "theories of colonial expansion and discourses on African primitiveness emphasize a historicity and the promotion of a particular model of history." Close quotes, and quotes, "both types of discourses are fundamentally reductionist. They speak about neither Africa nor Africans, but rather justify the process of inventing and conquering a continent and naming its primitiveness or disorder, as well as the subsequent means of its exploitation and methods of its regeneration." End quote. He is convinced that the rubric of the colonial establishment is still solidly in place after formal political independence. He writes, "In the early 1960s, the African scholar succeeded the anthropologist." Okay, so the anthropologist was central in the colonial days, and the African scholar takes his place. The native theologian replaced the missionary, that is your pastor and your bishop, okay? And the politician took the place of the colonial commissioner. All of them find reasons for their vocations in the dialectic of the same and the other. So that is the end of that quote. A little later, he observes that in this respect, the new knowledge and its symbols do not destroy completely the relevance of the colonial library, nor the idealism of apostles of otherness. It has brought about new standards for the colonization and the democratization of historical reason, and has reformulated residual questions concerning ideological power and scientific orthodoxy. End quote. In particular, I am fascinated by Mudimbe's definition of colonialism, which he tells us comes from a Latin word meaning arrangement. So when you colonize, you rearrange. You rearrange things to suit you as the colonizer. And the reason I took interest in Mudimbe is that what I observe is that in the Anglophone countries, there is very little attention to him. And I think this particular position is so, I will show you my face again soon, but this particular position is so because if you look at the citations of Mudimbe in a lot of Anglophone writings, there's very little. There's very little. And so I took an interest in him and thought that it would help if we look at what he said and try to see how can it benefit us? How can it enrich our discourses? And I think that there are 5 areas in which Mudimbe is particularly useful. And so that we can start to rearrange what was arranged by colonialism. The first area is African studies. African studies is a term we love, but it belongs to the realm of area studies. Area studies are things like Latin American studies, Asian studies, African studies. But the question is, who divided the world the way it is divided? And the answer is Western imperialism. If you think about it, the geographers tell us there is only one continent called Eurasia. But Europe has managed, Western imperialism has managed to say that there are 2 continents, Asia and Europe. The definition of a continent is violated in order to have Europe as separate from Asia. And so African studies serves the imperialist map, the map that Western imperialism has drawn. Secondly, the very word Africa, is not an African word. We were named, we did not name ourselves. So, and that becomes a problem because when you buy a dog, what is the first thing you do? You name it. And that naming symbolizes ownership, and ownership symbolizes authority. And this term, African studies, then encourages us to homogenize a very large continent and talk as though all its peoples think alike, talk alike, and so on. And this is totally untrue. So I am suggesting, may it be time to talk about Yoruba studies rather than African studies, Igbo studies, and so on. Excuse me for 1 minute. The second thing that I observe is the whole issue of using appropriate theories. Mudimbe is not shy to use a Western theory, such as Foucault, as long as we use it to liberate ourselves. There is no help in abandoning all Western theories just because they are Western. My compatriot, Professor Peter Nyong'o, wrote a poem in which he said, "I brew with the enemy, but I drink with my kinsmen." And he was replying to Okot Bitek's Song of Lawino, where Lawino had accused Ochol, her husband, of having been castrated by the big books that he was reading in the libraries. And he replied, "No way, I am not virile. What I'm doing in those libraries is to get to brew with the enemy and to drink with my kinsmen." And we should not shy away from using appropriate Western theories as tools for post-colonial intellectual reconstruction, as long, of course, as we use them extremely critically. The third area, promoting sound interdisciplinary studies. Sound interdisciplinary studies. And here, I'm thinking about the fact that right now, disciplinary studies are in vogue. We have even a lot of university courses that say they are interdisciplinary. But how can you have interdisciplinary studies for undergraduates, for example, who are not yet grounded in any discipline? The analogy I use as an African, and some colleagues of mine have rejected it, is that interdisciplinary studies are like marriage. A 5-year-old cannot get married. He or she first has to grow up, understand their own body and their own psyche, and then say, now I want to get married, and find a partner. To tell undergraduates to undertake interdisciplinary studies is an exercise in futility. Or to try and engage in the interdisciplinary studies, even as postgraduates and scholars, without trying to work hard to understand another discipline other than our own, is problematic. And most important, I would like to emphasize that methodology is what distinguishes the disciplines more than subject matter. For example, political scientists, political psychologists, psychologists of politics, sociologists of politics, political philosophers, and others all study politics. And what distinguishes them is methodology. I also want to emphasize on this matter of interdisciplinary studies that the humanities must resist the pressure to adopt empirical approaches. This pressure comes from funders, who most of whom are social scientists. And so you will find when a student is going into presenting their master's proposal, and they're in philosophy or literature, they are asked, where is your hypothesis? Where are your hypotheses? Where is your questionnaire? How do you have a questionnaire when going for library research? And I know colleagues who have incorporated the empirical approach of the social sciences just so that they can impress a funder and get some cash. But I would like to say that that is selling your birthright for a bowl of lentils, to use biblical parlance. What we need is meaningful collaboration between the humanities and the social sciences. And Mudimbe shows the way. The invention of Africa, he tells us, was commissioned as a project to evaluate the status of philosophy, African philosophy. But Mudimbe did not restrict himself to African philosophy. He examines art, he examines theology, he examines anthropology, and he examines missionary literature before he finally homes in on philosophy. Because he understands that every discipline operates within a wider academic environment. And so we need to promote interdisciplinary studies. I wrote an article in 2009 in Thought and Practice titled Research Methodology in Philosophy, Guarding Against Undue Influence from the Social Sciences. And the reason is the humanities are under pressure. But we are not at war with the social sciences. They are our partners. We need the data they gather from the field. But our introspective approach must not be compromised, because when we compromise it, we impoverish the academic terrain. The next point that I look at has to do with breaking imperialistically imposed linguistic barriers. Francophone, Anglophone, Arabophone, Lusophone. These divisions have impoverished our academic pursuits. In 2019, at the end of October, I sat at the 3rd Biennial African Philosophy World Conference, and I heard for myself the renowned Professor Pauline Hundrenji appealing that all the conferences of the African Philosophical Society, African Philosophy Society, be interpreted, be translated into French. And he said there's a lot happening in the Francophone world that we in the Anglophone do not know. And that is true about the Arabophone and the Lusophone as well. Mudimbe went to school in French, using French, but he has bothered to learn English and to write the Invention of Africa in English and to give us a window into what is happening in the Francophone world. We must avoid the low-hanging fruits of always interacting only with people from our linguistic region, imposed linguistic region. This will happen through translations. This will happen as we bother to learn other imperialist languages that have been imposed on our continent. That sounds self-defeating, but it is not. Remember, we want to brew with the enemy and drink with our kinsmen and kinswomen. The enemy here is not any individual person of European descent, far from it, but it is Western imperialism. Finally, adopting new approaches to common themes. By common themes, I mean topics that the humanities and social sciences love to discuss. Here I pick two. One, ethnicity, nationality, and statehood. We discuss those a lot. But quite often, we don't define our terms clearly. For example, we talk a lot about the nation state. The nation state, are there nation states in Africa here? No. What we have are multi-ethnic states. But we try to mirror Europe. And so we say Kenya is a nation state. Uganda is it isn't. And in 2018, I wrote this article, Nationhood and Statehood, the impact of a conflated discourse. I've shortened the title here. Ethnicity. We accept that the Zulu and the Yoruba are ethnic groups, but the Finns and the Icelanders, who are so few, are a nation with a flag, with flags at the United Nations. That is perpetuating colonialism. And the second theme I've picked here, as I come towards the end, is development. We take it for granted that Africa needs development. But does it? What is development anyway? Development is by and large trying to be like Europe. What we need is to remodel our own future. There is literature showing that as the colonialists were planning to leave, they are the ones who crafted the development discourse so that they can remain relevant as development partners. This idea of development suggests Europe, North America are developed, and Africa is playing catch up. And so I want to conclude, as I see I have done quite a bit, but I think I still have a few more minutes, but I'd like to conclude this so that we can start talking. I'd like to conclude by saying that in the foregoing reflections, I have not sought to offer an exhaustive exposition of Mudimbe's arguments in the Invention of Africa, but rather to glean ways in which the humanities and social sciences in the African context can benefit from his conceptual and methodological insights. I have argued that it is time to consider framing our academic discourses in terms of references to our various peoples as they identify themselves, rather than to think in terms of the indeterminate phrase, African studies. And I know I've not elaborated on this much, so I hope it will come out in the discussion. In addition, I have contended that Mudimbe's reflections should inspire scholars in the humanities and social sciences within the African context to be open to deploying useful insights from the West and from all other parts of the world, rather than to retreat to their purported Africanness in the name of liberation. I have indicated that Mudimbe's interdisciplinary approach challenges us to abandon a hollow appeal to interdisciplinarity, as well as to refrain from engaging in interdisciplinary turf wars. That I didn't even mention much, but it is there in my larger paper, both of which are obstacles to sound scholarship. There are a lot of turf wars. Oh, you are a philosopher, you shouldn't be talking about the fourth industrial revolution. Oh, but well, I tell you what, the fourth industrial revolution is all about knowledge, the knowledge economy, artificial intelligence. What is more epistemological than that? Furthermore, I have pointed out Mudimbe's resolve to examine common socio-political themes under an emancipatory rubric that breaks away from the theoretical framework of what he calls the colonial library. Finally, I have noted that the work of breaking down the linguistic walls between various parts, or rather among various parts of our continent, must proceed in earnest for the enrichment of scholarship throughout our continent. Although Mudimbe ends his book on a positive note, observing that the self-assertion of African politicians and academics is itself a liberating action, it is clear that he is extremely dissatisfied with the progress made so far in liberating scholarship on African cultures from hegemonic Western discourses. And he has good reasons for this dissatisfaction. It is my hope that we shall all double our efforts to contribute to scholarship that correctly represents the realities in our continent and engages with scholarship from all other parts of the globe on an equal footing. And I emphasize an equal footing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Odio, for a very thought-provoking, and I think it's a call to action for many scholars in Africa to really consider how do we go forward given the imperial violence that we have faced as a continent. How do we go forward as scholars given this very that's troublesome epistemic violence that you have experienced? And I should say that I'm quite sympathetic to your views, and I'm glad that you brought Mudimbe's the invention of Africa back on the table, given that it raises philosophical questions that are prevalent to the decolonial project that many scholars, I'm sure, who are here have embarked on in this day and age. Before I take questions from the floor, I have a couple of questions myself, given that I'm quite interested in Mudimbe's invention of Africa at the present moment. And I wanted to hear your thoughts about maybe 2 points. I think the first question that I have is, do you think that as African scholars, we will always be locked in a relation to what Mudimbe terms the colonial library? And is this relation in of itself a way that Africa continues to be defined by the colonial library? And I speak about this particularly because we as African scholars tend to the way we situate ourselves and relate ourselves to colonial library is in a resistance to it. But resistance to it is still in a way relation to it. And I think the question really highlights the problematic of whether this relation of itself is a problematic relation, because it seems like we're always going to be tethered to the colonial library. I was wondering your thoughts on that. And another question, if I may, is a question of whether we should actually think of theories as belonging to a space. I think the notion of belonging and ownership is it's a very imperialist notion in of itself, and I think it has been mapped onto epistemic orders and knowledge systems. So does this idea of like theories belonging to Europe or Africa or Asia, is this not something that's problematic, because it seems to somewhat ignore the movement of ideas, for example, which is a very important concept to consider. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on these two questions before we open up to the floor.
Thank you very much. On the first question of the colonial library, are we forever tied to it? Because we tend to always be bashing it, answering it, resisting it. I would say that the colonial library is so powerful that because we are always having younger scholars, and because there's so much literature that subscribes to that library, it will be necessary to keep answering it. Otherwise, some people may end up floating into its deep end without even knowing. But we must start being more busy exploring our own ideas, yes. And on whether theories belong to regions, I agree with you that the West loves to own, especially capitalism. That's why they have individual property rights. But we should ourselves think in terms of, is an idea useful? And if it's useful, let's use it. I have never heard anybody refusing to take a flight because airplanes were invented in America rather than in Timbuktu. So in the same way, let's use anything that's useful. It's part of the human heritage. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
And I love the way that if we can have quick questions and quick answers, we can hear more voices. Thank you.
Of course. I would, just as Dr. Audio has instructed, I would like to open questions to the floor. You are more than welcome to raise your hand so that I may see who is interested in contributing. Then you can be unmuted. Are there any questions so far? Okay, I'm not seeing any questions so far. Oh, yes, we have a question from Sanen Lovu.
Thank you, Ole. Thank you, Dr. Reginald. I just like the question, do you think that it's possible to brew with the enemy and drink with my kinsman in a field like philosophy? I feel like most of the time when we try to borrow from the Western ideas, we end up promoting the Western idea, or the Western idea holds more power in a way that's like the African approaches are silenced or not promoted. So is it possible to balance or promote the African idea more than the Western?
Thank you very much. To this, I would answer that we are doing it all the time. Even in this very session, we are using a foreign language. And it is not necessarily stopping us from highlighting our predicament and continuing the process of thinking how to get out of it. Furthermore, if we find it so repugnant to look at ideas that have been generated within the context of Western imperialism, then we put ourselves in a cocoon. And as we do, those ideas prosper unchallenged in the rest of the globe, and therefore are falsely validated. So I would say that I am reminded of George Orwell's 1984. In that mythical book of Goldstein, Goldstein writes that Africa is not part of the world economy. And much as we don't want to be swallowed by globalization, we also ought not to allow globalization, which is highly dominated by Western imperialism, to peddle myths against our peoples unchallenged. And we cannot challenge them if we don't know them. And that's why I think it is possible to brew with the enemy and to drink with our people. But certainly we can continue the conversation in the coming days.
Thank you, Dr. Odio. Are there other questions that people might have? Oh yes, we have Sanya Osha who has a question or comment.
Thank you so much, Regina, for such a, as Onerato rightly put it, thought-provoking presentation, very wide-ranging, very appreciative reading of Mudimbe. And from an Anglophone perspective, I think you did very well in highlighting a lot of the ideas he raises and the questions he also raises in his landmark book, The Invention of Africa. Now, he has this very specific way of addressing African philosophy. And I know you also have a strong penchant or advocacy of Kwesi Weredu's work, which is very different from Mudimbe's work. Now you raise a lot of questions. First of all, the question of African philosophy. So which methodological approach would you advance? Would it be Mudimbe in this instance, or would it be Weredu? Because I know you've worked a lot on Kwesi Weredu. And then the question of interdisciplinarity, you question it in terms of how it's been articulated or pursued within the academy, contemporary academy, and then that's one. Which approach would you say it's viable? Because you're talking a lot about interdisciplinarity. So how do you, what do you think would be a good approach to pursue that within the academy? That's the second question. And the final question is the question of terms and methodologies in terms of how ethnicity and what have you, how the colonial project has sort of thrown everything into disarray for us as Africans. I mean, when you mentioned the very important point about nationhood and nationality and what have you, how do we address that? Because we are still stuck in the quagmire with all these confusing terms. So, so like, I'm just trying to address the range of issues you address in your presentation. One pertaining to the question of African philosophy, the second pertaining to the question of interdisciplinarity, and finally the terms, the conditions and concepts that we live by daily as Africans that are confusing and we haven't addressed properly. So I just want you to elaborate on all these various issues which you touch upon. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Osha. The first question on the methodology in philosophy, I would say that for me, philosophy has one methodology, one method, reflection. reflection. And then it has a range of techniques of reflection, such as the phenomenological technique, the rational technique, the analytic technique. Analytic technique looks at language, rational technique looks at argumentation mainly. The critical technique, very related to the rational. The phenomenological is exploring consciousness. And every philosopher needs to choose a range of these according to his or her needs and dictated by the subject that they are exploring. What we must not do is capitulate to the fieldwork approach of the social sciences, although we can use it when we need it, the way Odera Oruka used it in stage philosophy, for example. But we should not be beholden to it. On the issue of interdisciplinary studies, what I say is, let us have teams, sociologists, political philosophers, psychologists, people from literature, people from art, fine art, philosophy, sit together and map out our competencies and clearly spell out what we will bring to a research project that will enrich the research project. And let each other understand what everybody else is contributing. And let there be a discussion on how to coordinate these various perspectives into a coherent picture that produces a useful research project. On the issues of the terms that plague us, such as development, ethnicity, and so on, philosophers and others will need to continue reflections on the meanings of these terms and expose the neocolonial strategy of misusing them. That's what I would say. I don't know whether I have said anything useful, Sanya, but trying to be very fast, that's what I would say.
Thank you, Dr. Wadio. I have another question from Wambui Wamunyu from Daystar University. They state, if the call for post-coloniality is to rearrange anew, do we have the resources, i.e. the time and funding are especially scarce for academics in this part of the world? So do we have the resources to engage it? Just to repeat the question, if the core of post-coloniality is to rearrange anew, do we have the resources to engage it?
Thank you very much. In my bigger paper, my real paper that is hopefully being published by IFRA Africa, I have emphasized that we in Africa need to learn how to operate on low budgets. We have been splashing cash, a splash of cash. You want to organize a conference, so you think about a big hotel, badges, caps, t-shirts, conference bags. What are all those for? Why not meet in a university auditorium? Make simple name tags. Let everybody come in, lodge wherever they do, come in and confer, go back where we came from. But because we have made conferences so expensive, that's why we need so much cash. Why not have open access journals that are continent-wide? not little journals that are all over and are competing, but maybe 5 journals, 6 in each discipline, or even 2 or 3. And we support it from all our institutions and have high quality peer review and high quality papers. Charge no one for reviewing, charge no one for processing, charge no one for anything, but put in our time and use open access more fully. We charged no one in thought and practice, for example. So, because when we rely on foreign funding too much, our topics are also guided by the funder. Because as the Jewish people say, he who has the wallet has the agenda. That would be my short answer.
Thank you, Dr. Odi. I think you make a very compelling case for us to work within our means. I think that we tend to want to replicate a lot of what the West does, and we don't actually realize how limiting that can be, as opposed to seeing it as a point of progress. So I think that I really do sympathize with that point that you just raised. Are there any other questions that colleagues might have? We might have to close the session in about 6 minutes. I hope there's perhaps 1 or 2 more questions to consider. As Dr. Audio said, if questions are short, we can also keep the answers short. Oh yes, thank you. We have Babaka Fai, who would like to ask a question or comment.
Yes, thanks, Horato, and thank you so much, Dr. Regina, for your thought-provoking presentation. I have a very short question. While I was listening to your brilliant and thought-provoking presentation, I think I did not hear about political leadership, and I love your idea of many African nations not being, many African countries not being nations yet. They are ethnic nations, and this is very true. So we have to face the fact that our countries are still struggling, like Sanya said, with ethnicity. So what is the role of political leadership in this difficult task of undoing the ethnic traps that we all live in? So this is my very short question. Thank you so much again.
Thank you. Every scholar has a pet topic, and the one you have raised is mine. I take a very unconventional position that our countries are artificial countries whose borders were drawn in Berlin in the 1880s. Take Kenya, for example. You have Maasais in Kenya, Maasais in Uganda, in Tanzania, sorry. Tesos in Kenya, Tesos in Uganda. My own people, the Luo in Kenya, the Luo in Tanzania. And then we say Kenya is a nation, or that we want to work towards being a nation. I don't think we need to work towards being a nation. I think we need to work with the fact that we are a multinational state and work towards intercultural or international, or even if you like, inter-ethnic justice. Our biggest problem is that the ethnic groups that grab power marginalize large swathes of their compatriots, and so there is ongoing tension. And that's why I take the view that our problem is not ethnicity. Our problem is bad leadership and our struggle to build ethnically blind societies when our people still have significant loyalties to their cultural identities. And those cultural identities are not crimes. we need to work with people as they are, not as we think they ought to be. And that's not original. Claude Ake said exactly that in at least one of his essays. And I have written a number of things on that. One of them you will readily find on the internet, Kenya Beyond Liberal Democracy. If you Google Kenya Beyond Liberal Democracy, I have shared my thoughts about that, and more work are in the offing on that topic. Let me just leave it at that for now, but I hope we can engage further on that topic.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you so much. I think that we are about 2 minutes away from ending the session. So if anybody has a quick question, they could probably raise it now. Otherwise, I can just close off the session. Are there any final thoughts or questions that people want to raise? I'll take that as a lapse. But for now, I just want to thank everyone for attending today. And thank you, Dr. Audio, for giving us your time and sharing your thoughts with us in issues concerning the direction of African scholarship going forward. So thank you all for joining us. And later today at 4 p.m. South African Standard Time, we have one of our own at HUMA, Ralph Boland, presenting a doctoral seminar titled Pursuing an Idea, the Unfolding of a PhD Project. I hope all aspiring and current PhD students will be able to join, what will definitely be a very informative seminar. Otherwise, thank you all, and we look forward to welcoming you back in future sessions, which you can get more information on through our website. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much.